My parents came from. My dad was came from Indiana. My mom came from Kentucky. So my grandmother still lived in Kentucky. She was a school teacher, old school schoolhouse, back in the country in the day. So growing up, my mom would send me back there periodically from time to time. And so during this time, which was the early 50s, of course, Jim Crow was the law of the land. So it was very, very real. So I had those experiences, back there in terms of race and racism. I experienced the Jim Crow, the strict separation, the
Segregation.
the segregation, the water fountains for the coloreds and the water fountains and the separate bathrooms and the stores and the restaurants that would say we don't serve Negroes or we don't serve you here. So I experienced all of that, there. And then coming back here, living in Orange County. Orange County at the time was very, very conservative, as I'm sure some people would remember. And the organization that really had a grip here politically was the John Birch Society. So we as black people considered the John Birch Society to be halfway between the Republican Party and the KKK. So my experience here was racism. It was more direct. Still the attitude of segregation and separation was here, but they didn't have the force of law like they had in the South. And me growing up in Santa Ana, especially was in the 50s, the racism was pretty intense. And so in school, like when I went to elementary school, for example, it was just me and my next door neighbor. We were the only two black kids in the school. And I never will forget a time. This was an incident that happened. I was in the fourth grade. And every day when we would walk to school, there would be a group of 5 or 6 white kids. And they would, we'd get to a certain point on the way to school, and they'd pop up out of the bushes and throw rocks at us, but they stayed further enough away. But they would throw rocks and just be going, nigger, 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 nigger. And that happened every day. It happened on the playground. When we're doing recess, so I go home and tell my mom, I says, Mom, these kids are doing this like every day on the playground. She said, tell the teacher. And I'm like, the teacher's standing right there watching and not saying it. She said, well, you need to say something. So I said something to the teacher, and the teacher says, you need to go see the principal. His name was Mr. Emily. And so she walks me over to his office. And I remember I go in his office, and she sits down. He looks at her, and he says, close the door. And she walked out. And he looked at me, and he leaned across the table, and he said, what's wrong with you? And I said, well, these kids are over here throwing rocks at us and calling us niggers. And he says, what's the problem with that? He said, you are a nigger.
Oh, man.
And he said, let me tell you something. He says, you were born a nigger. He said, you'll live a nigger. You'll always be a nigger. He says, you will never be better than white people. He said, don't you think anything about that? And then he grabbed me and walked me across the playground. And he sat me down. He says, you're not allowed on this side of the playground. He said, don't ever let me catch you on this side of the playground, So my friend falls, hurts his knee. So we're the only 2 blacks. I got to support him. So I'm like, I'm going to walk him to the nurse's office, right? So I go to the nurse. As soon as I walked in, the nurse gets on the phone. Emily walks into the nurse's office. He looks at me, and he grabs me from behind my neck, and he picks me up. He said, you little nigger. He said, I told you never come over here. And he walks me across and then slams me down on this table, And so I remember reaching behind my neck, and it was bleeding. He had literally picked me up. So I went home and told my dad, and my dad said, I know Emily. He said, I worked with him in the post office. He said, he's a card carrying KKK. So there was a KKK chapter in Orange County. I've seen pictures of it and everything. And so that was my experience in elementary school.
What did that make you feel like?
I mean, it was scary, But one thing I never did, I never just developed like I just hate white people. I always judge people individually, and because I had white friends too, and I had good experiences with white people. So I never took that attitude like I just hate all white people because of that one experience. And so, but even in junior high school, we were very separated. We experienced segregation, I know in the prison system, the racial politics are pretty heavy. But even at schools, it was the same way. Teachers, in high school, teachers would call us names and so on and so forth. And we were treated differently. We knew it. Every day I woke up in my life, I felt like I was reminded, something would happen to remind me that I was black, So that I never could escape that. Yeah. So we were always, there was conflict and we were running into these type of things. So that was kind of my thing. And then in the 60s when I experiencing these things, I wanted to do something about it. I thought, what, we got to fix this. We need to fight back. That's when I got introduced to the Black Panther Party. And so it was very attractive to me because I thought we could do something. I already had a militant mindset. I wasn't about the NAACP or Martin Luther King, march and let people beat on you, that kind of thing. I was more about, we're going to fight. So I was drawn to the Black Panther Party for that. And so that kind of occupied my life for about 3 or 4 years from there. So that was kind of my initial experiences that kind of shaped me in terms of my views on race and racism. And
what was it like being in the Black Panther Party?
it was interesting because the Black Panther Party we weren't a group we were very political. So we latched on to Marxism big time. We latched on to Chairman Mao. China was very communistic at that point in time, and Mao Zedong had led the revolution there. And then we studied Marx and Lenin and Stalin, so we were very Marxist. So we would actually make alliances with anybody regardless of race. And so we developed alliances with the Mexican community when they developed the Brown Berets. There was a group out of the South that was considered the white group. They were Appalachians, the Young Patriots was the name of them. So we sought to develop, those type of relationships with just about anybody. But of course, race played a role, and all the police that we'd run into were always all white. There wasn't really hardly any black police officers or anything in Santa Ana where I grew up. And so that was kind of the environment, I guess you could say, that we were in. And so eventually, me and a friend of mine, we started dealing drugs, just casually, that kind of thing. And through the course of that, I began to use the drugs I was dealing. And we dealt cocaine when it was very popular in the early 70s. And so I started mixing it with heroin, back and forth, speedballing and those kind of things. And then eventually I found myself strung out on heroin. And so it was just kind of downhill from there. And eventually I had a major addiction. I was just doing $200 a day minimum, just to stay well. I hardly wasn't even getting high anymore. And of course, I was stealing and robbing and burglarizing like crazy. Eventually, I get arrested, and then I get sentenced. They sentenced me to 6 years in state prison behind that. And I went to Chino. By this time, I was pretty broken, and I was scared because I thought, okay, I'm going to get off of it. I'm going to kick the drugs. I kicked him in the county jail. And then I thought I'm going to do 6 years in prison, but I still had that burning desire for the drugs, And so when I ended up, by the time I got to Chino, I was ready. I was pretty broken. So I went to a chapel service there and surrendered my life to Christ at that point in time. And
that's when everything started to change.
That's when life started.
Yeah.
It was like, thank you, Lord. Yeah.